So we have already started the welcome and introductions, and so I'll move into the overview of the conservation standards. Then Catherine is going to share a little bit more about the community and how you can get involved. And then we'll have time, as Catherine mentioned, for questions and discussion. But please do feel free to pop questions into the chat. Also, if somebody's got a clarifying question, feel free to raise your hand as we go along, and maybe Catherine can monitor for that. As Catherine mentioned, we're really excited. We've recently launched this partnership with the Society for Conservation Biology, Conservation Measures Partnership, and the Conservation Coaches Network. And you'll hear a little bit more about these two entities as we go along. So really looking forward to getting to know one another more and collaborating more. So now I'll share with you just a little bit of an overview of the conservation standards. The full name is the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation. This is version 4.0 of the conservation standards. This is our cycle. I'll talk a little bit about this in a bit, but it's basically a project management cycle that has several steps and principles and good practices or best practices associated with it. So a little bit about where the conservation standards came from. The first version was released in 2004, and it drew on a few different things. One thing that provided kind of a foundation for the initial version was some research that my organization did. It was funded by the Moore Foundation. And at that point in time, there wasn't really a lot happening in the conservation community there wasn't a lot of clarity on monitoring and evaluation and kind of standard project cycle management approaches. And so we really wanted to take a step back and learn from what was being done in different fields and use that as a starting point to try to think about what would be some good approaches and practices that we should use in the conservation community. And so we looked across all these communities or these fields, including conservation. And that's an important aspect because so what came out of this were some guiding principles, some very basic principles, but also some of what ended up in the conservation standards, kind of the meat around the principles came from organizations that had been doing work like the Nature Conservancy, drawing on a lot of their work that they had done around ecosystem and species viability and threat ratings. And so that's just an example of how some of the initial members of CMP kind of helped form what ultimately became the conservation standards. So we had these practices and principles. We had some of the experiences from the founding members. And then there was also some work early on to clarify the different terminology that groups were using. Kind of one of the first things that some of these founding members realized, actually, I want to back up for a minute. One of the motivations behind founding the Conservation Measures Partnership was that there were a lot of groups, individuals within these different member organizations that were working in conservation and understanding that there was a lot of money being spent in conservation and a lot of work being done, a lot of great work, but also no really real ability or there wasn't any clear monitoring, evaluation, learning, and sharing that was happening. And so they recognized this potential that if we could work together, if we could work collaboratively, we could learn from one another and get better at conservation. So that was a really important basis for the founding of CMP. So one of the early things that the founding members did was say, well, we can't really learn from one another if we're speaking different languages. And so they kind of mapped the languages across their different organizations, recognized that they're using similar terminology for different things, and decided on a common language that became the basis for the language that now exists in the conservation standards. So that's a little bit about where some of the the early stages of the conservation standards. I'm going to share a little bit more about the actual process. I'm happy to go more into the history for anybody else who really wants to know that. But so this is a 5-step cycle. Really, teams might enter the cycle at different stages depending on where they are with their work. I'm just going to explain it to you kind of as if a team is starting from this beginning. So the first part is the assess step, which is really kind of understanding the context within which a team is working, clarifying that, coming to a common shared understanding, and then using that shared understanding to move into the plan step where they determine what are they going to do to try to address the context within which they're working. How are they going to try to conserve their priority ecosystems or species? And so this gets into a lot of the actions that and setting goals and objectives. The implement step is then about taking that plan and turning it into actions, work plan, budget, timeline. And it's also thinking about the monitoring too. It's not just the implementation of actions, but also the implementation of monitoring so that when you get to this analyze and adapt stage, you're ready, you've got data that will help you understand whether you're being effective or not. And you can take a moment to pause and understand what's happening and adapt as you need to. And then the share step is about sharing both within your team, but also with the broader conservation community and evidence base. So I'm going to walk you through these steps a little more concretely with an example and some common tools that we use. So the example I'm going to use is some work that I did with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, their Atlantic Coast joint venture. They were working on salt marsh bird conservation across the Atlantic coast of the United States. And so I'm going to share this example. It's a highly simplified example. The intent really is just to kind of give you a flavor of the process and how we use some of these key tools. One thing I'll say about, I'm going to show you some boxes and arrows and diagrams, and these are common tools that we use within this process, but I want to take us back and just remind you that really the conservation standards is about a set of principles and practices, and it's not the diagrams themselves. It's more about, for example, you need to understand the context. So you lay out the context however makes sense to you, whether it's in a diagrammatic form or maybe it's a narrative. There's a lot of flexibility for how things are done. I'm just going to share with you some of the very common tools that we use with teams. So on that note, diving into this salt marsh example and this very first step, this is where the assess step, where we try to lay out the context and develop what we call a situation model with teams. And so in this case, they identified the scope of the work that they were doing, working on U.S. Atlantic coast salt marshes and species. And within that, some of their priority ecosystems and species. This was more specific than what you're seeing here. An important step here too is to also think in many contexts, in most contexts, it's not, teams are working to conserve ecosystems and species, but there's also some thought and attention to the communities that live in the area or that benefit from these. And so trying to understand and that depend on these ecosystems and species. So we often trace out what are some of the ecosystem services or human well-being benefits that come from these ecosystems and species being in good shape. So once we're kind of clear on our ecosystems and species that we are working to conserve, we think about what are some of the direct threats or the human actions that might be directly degrading these ecosystems and species. And then we recognize that not all threats are equal. So it's important. This whole process is about decision making and prioritizations. So we're making decisions when we narrow down what it is that we're going to focus on. We're making decisions when we identify the threats, and then we prioritize them or we rate them to try to get a sense of which are the greater threats, and with all things being equal, where we might want to spend more effort. And then we trace it back and we think about, well, what are some of the drivers behind these different threats? So in this land use incompatible with marsh migration, you have some factors related to landowners and farmers that either want to keep their fields and agriculture, or they don't want to cut forests back. But you also have some economic factors and kind of policy things that are also impacting this. So we use this, it's tracing back the social, the economic, the legal, the political, cultural factors that are influencing positively or negatively the context. And once we've got that picture, we start, so this is all about the assess step, understanding the context. Now we're going to move into the plan step, where we use that context to think about what are we going to do given this context. How can we come in and intervene and make a difference? And so these yellow hexagons in this language, this diagrammatic language, these represent different strategies or actions that the team might take, and they tend to be things that they might work directly on the ecosystems or species, so restoration sort of things. They might work on the direct threats themselves, so you could have something about removal of invasives, for example, or some sort of invasives management strategy. And then they can also work on some of these drivers behind the direct threats. I'm going to take this one in particular, exploring incentive programs with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and walk you through another tool that we use. So this is the situation models. We also use theories of change, and the idea behind theories of change is saying, well, if we want to work on incentive programs with NRCS, for example, why are we doing that? How does that get us to conserving these avian species that we care about? And so it's an opportunity to get really explicit about what are the results that we expect to see coming out of here. So this team, again, reminder that this is highly simplified, but they identified that through going through this strategy, they wanted NRCS to incorporate conservation for salt marsh migration into its incentive programs. They expected that priority landowners would value those incentives. And if they valued them, then they would sign up with NRCS. And if they signed up with NRCS, then they would use the practices under NRCS, and land use would be compatible with marsh migration, which would have positive effects over here on the ecosystems and species. So this kind of provides a framework for then moving to thinking about goals and objectives. So goals in this process tend to be tied to the ecosystems or species. Whether we call them goals or you could call this anything, but the main point is that it's important to define what you expect to see or need to see over here with your ecosystems and species, but not stop there. And I'll get to that in a moment. But so we kind of coach teams through this process to define specific measurable goals and objectives. And in doing so, then the indicator for how you're going to know if you're meeting that goal falls right out of it. We have a more detailed process I'm not going to get into, but to help to coach teams through identifying key characteristics of viability so that they can arrive at these goals pretty easily once they've gone through that process. So it's not enough, though, to just say we're going to do this incentive program and then see how the marsh and avian species are doing. we want to know really, do we have any evidence or that this particular strategy is being effective? So we're going to want to look at things along here. So perhaps we have an objective tied to here that NRCS is going to incorporate a menu of practices that address salt marsh migration, and your indicator drops right out of that. Or maybe you have an objective over here that at any point in time, at least 90% of the priority landowners signed up with NRCS are managing for marsh migration, and that indicator also then can kind of drop right out of here. So this basically provides a framework for setting goals and objectives that are really clearly tied to what you expect or need to see. I'm going to pause there for a minute because I think there might be questions or.
No, we're okay, Caroline. I was just
okay.
Julia just had a question about pros and cons of using, theories of change or results chains over log frames, and I was suggesting maybe let's save that discussion and have it at the end. That's
perfect.
quite fun. Yeah,
sounds great. Okay. Good question. So now I'm going to move from, this is kind of setting us up for our strategic plan, but then the next step is moving into implementation. So these theories of change, again, kind of provide a nice framework for thinking about what are the actions or the activities that you need to take to help you make sure that you see these results that you expect. So these are what you're seeing in yellow are the actual actions that are tied to getting that incentives program up and going. But we also in this process say you should be thinking during your implementation and you should be planning for and budgeting for your monitoring activities too. So implementation is about both rolling out the strategy, but also monitoring and seeing if you are getting the results that you expect, so that when you move into the next step, which is the analyze and adapt step, you've got the data that can help you see, are you seeing the results you expected? Are you meeting your objectives? So for example, maybe the team is seeing they've are seeing these results, they're seeing good progress here, they've met their objective. But as they go further down, some landowners are signing up with NRCS, but not all. They've partially achieved their objective. They're not really seeing the things they expected to see over here. And then this can provide a reflection point for, okay, why is that? Is it too early? Is this not the right strategy? Does there need to be another strategy that comes in and combines with this? So if it's basically providing a framework for a team to start thinking about what's going on and have these discussions and reflection. And then the last part is sharing the results, making sure all your team and your partners are clear about what's happening here and providing input, but then also sharing with the broader conservation community, making sure that the information gets into that broader community. On that note, I think I turn it over to Catherine here.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Caroline. I wonder actually, maybe we should just, while we're talking about theories of change, address Julia's question now. So just to recap, Julia was asking, what are the kind of pros and cons of using this particular approach over, I think you've asked, the conservation standards in comparison to using log frames. Did you want to respond to that, Caroline, and I can follow up? Or?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll give my initial thoughts, and maybe I'll go back to sharing my screen.
Yeah.
I think one of the really nice things about this approach over the log frame, I mean, they're clearly tied, and I've actually done exercises to map log frames to theories of change and vice versa. But what this, and you don't really get this from this example, but what it does do is it allows for branching and saying, it's not just like maybe in order for priority landowners to value incentives, you also have to have like some other outreach strategy coming in here. Or, you might even want to say, well, there's kind of an unexpected, or there's a potential that that something else could happen, and we could see some negative effects, and you can kind of branch things out and create a little more direct connection between things. I think log frames tend to put things in columns, and the relationship between one factor and another is not always so clear. And so I think there's a bit more flexibility with this to try and map out those relationships.
Yeah,
I
would agree with everything that Caroline said there. I think, can you just go to your next, the analyze and adapt
one? You want the?
Yeah, with the things up. Thanks. So this, for me, like, I would echo everything that Caroline has said, and I want to reassure people that if you develop a theory of change like this with your monitoring plan developed, you've got all the ingredients you need to deliver a log frame for your donor or whoever it might be. So they are, they're very compatible in that sense. But for me, working with teams, the real power here is to really make those connections. So you heard, as Caroline read through that, she said, if this happens, then the next thing will happen. If that happens, then the next thing will happen. So being able to actually lay that out is really, really useful to help the team understand, is this strategy actually going to lead to the desired results that we want to see? In a very visual way. And if you're working on this with teams, you're using post-it notes or various things online to really create that theory of change in a very, very visual way that can really stimulate thinking. So that would be the first advantage, I think. But the second one, and the real strength for me is exactly what's on the screen now. So being able to take that information from your monitoring data, your indicator data, and actually put that back on your original assumptions and start to ask those questions. Are things working the way that we expected them to? Are they not? Why not? So instead of, just going and perhaps doing more promotion of this NRCS incentive scheme and getting, sending out more leaflets or ringing up more landowners to talk to them about it, what we're really interested in here is, why are they not signing up? So they've got the information, they can see the value in it, because we know that because we've got our green marker on that second blue box, but they're not all signing up. We wanted 90%, but only 25% are signing up. So why is that? You can be much more targeted in that trying to work out what's going on, and as Caroline said, add new strategies, or maybe invest in something else. Maybe we need to give it a little bit more time. So, and I'm sure you could do similar things with log frames. There's something magic that happens with doing it in a visual way that I've found working with teams that can really start to narrow down and identify where the things are working or not working. So yeah, those are just a few thoughts, but as I say, as we both said from the start, there's many situations where you could cross-reference or kind of crosswalk one to the other, if you have, for whatever reason, organizationally or donor reasons for using one or the other. Yeah, so hopefully that helps. Julia, if there's anything else we wanted to cover on that or further discussion, do put that in the chat. What I'm going to do is jump into thinking a little bit more about the conservation standards community now. So, sorry, I just got distracted by James's comment. Seems like CNP was at the forefront of using theory of change for conservation before it became a major tool. Yeah, leading the way. No, I'm not sure if that's entirely true. Caroline, you might know more about that.
Well, I think it was. I think CNP, the conservation standards community, has taken it to a new level. But I do remember when we first started with this, the field of public health was doing a lot of this, and we kind of stole that was that original work where we looked across fields and said, we don't need to reinvent this. So we stole a lot of stuff from other fields. But I do have to say it, there was at one point in time that I went to an American Evaluation Association, and I'd always felt like, initially our feeling was, oh my God, the conservation standards community is so far behind. And then I went to this evaluation conference. I was like, wow, we are so much further ahead now. So it's cool. was really
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, it's really nice to see those parallels as well between other sectors as well, and you're learning from each other. I think stealing is maybe a bit of a strong word, Caroline. Borrowing, sharing,
Borrowing,
one
building
another.
upon. Yeah.
All right, so let's jump into thinking a little bit more. So you've heard a very brief introduction around what the conservation standards are. As Caroline's mentioned, that was a simplified example, and we've just picked out 2 of those tools and kind of illustrated how you might work through one of those with a conservation project. You could apply those same tools and the rest of the conservation standards toolbox at a species level project, right through to protected area, a transboundary project across multiple countries, global policy, an organization. That we really want to emphasize the flexibility of this framework. It's a mindset, it's a way of thinking that can help you design and deliver, and then also monitor and adapt your conservation work more effectively. All right. To do all of that, there is an amazing community of people who are based around the world who are really knowledgeable about the conservation standards, really committed to using this process and continuing to improve it and improve best practice basically over time. So I'm going to introduce you to a little bit more about what that's all about and also how you can get involved. So we've heard a little bit about the Conservation Measures Partnership already. Caroline and I are both here representing CMP. There's another community of practice, so you can kind of think of these 2 as maybe sister organizations sort of thing, the Conservation Coaches Network, and I'm going to walk you through both of those, how they're different and how they work together. So first of all, the Conservation Measures Partnership. This is a group or a consortium of organizations, and those organizations might be NGOs, they might be government agencies, they might be donors or funding bodies, they might be private businesses. Okay, and I'll show you some of those, some of our members just in a second. The key thing here being that CMP are the stewards of the conservation standards, so responsible for updating, improving, developing guidance around the conservation standards. You heard Caroline say that we're currently on version 4. Continuing to draw from those different sectors, as we just mentioned, and improve the product and its associated tools and guidance over time. And it is constantly evolving. There are changes. We're constantly kind of bringing in new and developing new guidance around integrating climate change, or thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. How do we bring that into our conservation projects and into the conservation standards toolkit? How do we think about nature-based solutions or interactions with other large frameworks within the conservation sphere, like science-based target network, things like that? Okay, so key thing here, CMP is the members are organizations and they act as the stewards of the conservation standards, and we're regularly having members meetings, retreats, working groups, initiatives to kind of drive this work forward. Here are our current members. You might see potentially even some of your own organizations on there, and you'll see they're kind of first of all very international. There's kind of organizations from different parts of the world.
Wow.
You've also got, as I mentioned, some of those government agencies, NGOs, and also private businesses and the funding
partnership
as well. The Conservation Coaches Network is same but different. Okay, so the Conservation Coaches Network is a global community of what we call conservation coaches, funnily enough. So conservation coaches are people who trained in this process and kind of provided with those skills or train and practice those skills to be able to walk teams through this particular process. There are coaches all over the world, and I'll show you some examples in a second, but essentially CCNet exists to support those coaches, continue to train, provide more resources, all those sorts of things, provide that supportive network to enable those coaches to do the best job they can in terms of supporting other teams to work through the conservation standards process. So I mentioned CMP, their members are organisations, CCNet members are individuals. So Caroline and I are both coaches, we're both part of CCNet, and we're also involved with CMP through our own organisations as well. CCNet is organised into regional and thematic networks. So I'm going to show you a few of those now. I can, whoops, there we go. So hopefully you'll see your region represented here. There are regional, so it's a global network, and then within that there are also regional networks. And there's also down the bottom 2 thematic networks as well. So teaching adaptive management is really about how we can start to integrate the conservation standards into university curricula. So I noticed there's a few people here from universities. That might be something you're interested in finding a little bit more about. And then the other one there, conservation standards projects, largely working with Indigenous, on Indigenous land and water and with Indigenous communities. So that's being driven actually from a lot of work that's come out of Australia and working with Indigenous communities in Australia, but starting to be applied in various places in North America and Africa as well. So each of these groups sort of working and supporting coaches in their local area. So how do these 2 kind of entities work together? As we mentioned, there's a lot of crossover with sort of individuals across both. And essentially the conservation standards is the product that both groups are feeding into, working on developing new guidance for all of those sorts of things. So continuing to work together to improve the conservation standards and support the adoption and use of this set of tools that we think are really powerful in terms of delivering effective conservation. So that's a little bit about the conservation standards community. I just want to briefly give you a few ideas about, if you're excited about what you've seen here today, how you might be able to get involved and learn more. There's a few, I guess, suggestions we've got for you. The first one might be to take some training. There are a range of different training options available, from sort of self-paced, self-directed, free online training through to facilitated courses that might run over a week or a few weeks, that might be online or in person. But you're kind of working with a cohort of people, you've got that training team with you, right through to maybe slightly longer training through a particular university where you're working and building your skills in the conservation standards over a semester or something like that. So we're going to provide you with some links to all of these things where you can find out more. So receiving training might be one step. You might also be thinking, if you're working on a conservation project at the moment and you think, I'd really like to use some of these conservation standards tools within my own project, you might look at finding a coach from your local area or reaching out to your regional CCNet group to find out more about what they're up to and how they might be able to support your project. You might want to join a Conservation Measures Partnership initiative. So I've mentioned a little bit about this around the core of the conservation standards. There's a whole bunch of different learning initiatives going on. I talked about climate change or nature-based solutions, or looking at policy and governance, things like that. There are a whole bunch of these different initiatives that we would love to get more members coming in, and particularly from SCB. I mean, the range of experience that you guys have to bring in that perspective into these initiatives and support us with developing that guidance, and hopefully you guys benefiting from that as well. That would be amazing. So we're going to provide a link to finding out more about what initiatives are running, how you can get involved, who to get in touch with. And then a final option, or one of the other options, might be even establishing a course. So maybe working with the CCNet coaches in your area to establish a module or part of a conservation standards course within the university that you teach at or that you attend, or whatever it might be. So those are just a few ideas. Again, I'm hoping Caroline will be popping some links in the chat to find out more about that. Other really cool places you can go to find out more information. If you go to conservationstandards.org, you will see 3 different kind of pillars. You've got conservation standards in the middle that will tell you about the conservation standards themselves. You can download in multiple languages. You can look at case studies, look at some testimonial videos, all of those sorts of things. The Conservation Measures Partnership website obviously tells you a little bit more about CMP. It's also got the information about the initiatives, and then CCNet likewise a little bit more about finding a coach in your area, getting involved with your regional network of CCNet, finding out how to even become a coach if this is something that you're really interested in and want to pursue. Okay, so that's a kind of a one-stop shop to find out a lot of this information. You can also check out the Conservation Standards YouTube channel. There's a lot on there, particularly recently. We've been working a lot with people who've used the conservation standards to really capture their stories and tell their stories about how the conservation standards has helped them, or maybe even some of the challenges that they've found with using the conservation standards. So that's a really good place to hear from different voices around the world, how the conservation standards have been used in their context, from species projects right through to organizational adoption of these processes. And then we're on social media as well with Twitter and LinkedIn. So that's where we're going to stop actually with the slides. And we've got about 10 minutes or so, slightly over 10 minutes. We'd love to hear from you guys, questions, discussions, comments, yeah, keen to hear from you about anything you want to find out more about. So I'm going to stop sharing. Feel free to turn your cameras on if you're around and willing to show your face. We'd love to see you. Caroline, anything that I missed about the community that we need to add in?
Yeah, there was a question from Brent about whether coaches are available to assist with conservation projects, whether or not the coordinating organization is a CMP member or the project is a CMP initiative. And I said, absolutely. Coaches work with, I mean, most of the organizations and teams that they work with are not CMP members. We would love them to become CMP members, but the point is that they work with conservation teams around the world, and they're yeah. So that's a definite yes. There was also a question about whether we will be sharing the slides after this session, and I believe we will be.
Yeah, so we've been recording this session, and that will be hosted on the recording will be hosted on STB's Vimeo account. You should receive an email about that in the next few days. So hopefully that answers that question. The actual slides themselves, I'm not sure about, but at least we've got the video.
Maybe we could PDF them or something.
We could do a PDF if people are interested in that. Yeah. I just saw a question as well from James, is Mirati still the primary software platform for working through a project? We haven't even touched on Mirati. So for those of you who don't know, Mirati is the software that is designed to support the conservation standards. The first thing we want to say there is that you don't have to use Mirati. Mirati is a tool that you can use, but what we're really focusing on and what we wanted to focus on today was those principles. But since you've raised it, we'll talk about it. Mirati has come along in leaps and bounds in the last couple of years. There's a really amazing cloud-based version of Mirati now with online diagramming, a lot of cool functionality for designing some of those diagrams that Caroline walked us through, but also recording your indicator data, being able to do that kind of pause and reflect, look at where you are in your theories of change. So a lot of people who use the conservation standards really find Mirati valuable, but we do want to reiterate that it's not essential. What would the kind of the core is the principles and that mindset of doing adaptive management. Mirati is a great tool, and we're happy to point you in the direction of finding out more information about that as well.
And maybe just to build on that, Marathi is it's a tool, and that goes back to like one of my original points was what really matters about the standards is the principles behind them and the practices. And so so these tools don't work for everybody. A lot of people find them helpful. I really like them, but I always recognize when I work with a team that that might not work for them. So it is the tool that is the most comprehensive and that's specifically designed for the conservation standards. But we've also found during COVID, we've kind of expanded our whole suite of tools, and a lot of us use Miro or Mural or Google Slides, other software, at least for collaboration purposes, and then we might move things into Marathi depending on our preferences or how far we're going. But and so that there was also, well, actually,
Sorry,
maybe
Caroline,
does that
can I just say
answer that question?
Maybe just one more comment about Marathi, if I may. One thing that we didn't talk about, you saw kind of Caroline introduce you to those theories of change. One of the things that's really cool about Marathi is that it actually hosts a library of what we call generic theories of change or generic results change. So rather than starting from a blank slate each time, you can say, my project is about anti-poaching patrols. So what's the kind of a blueprint or a generic theory of change around anti-poaching patrols? You could go in and actually get that and use that as a starting point to start to build out your theory of change. Sorry, Caroline, did you already said that?
No. No, I guess I'll just say one more thing about Marathi that like kind of distinguishes it from Miro or some of the other tools that have been really great for collaboration purposes. But Marathi is also a relational database, so it stores data associated with factors that you can then come back to, and you can report, like you saw on the slides, like on progress, and it'll store your progress data over years, and so it's it's multidimensional, whereas like some of the other things are flatter but are really great for collaboration. There was a question about trainings to become a coach. Are they remote or in person? And Catherine, as far as I know, they're all in person. I don't think CCNet's done any virtual ones.
CCNet Europe have talked about it once or twice, but coach trainings generally tend to be in person, but they are run in different parts of the world. So there'll be regularly there'll be one in the UK this year if anybody's interested, but there's regular ones in other parts of the world as well. The practitioner level training, so kind of getting your head around the different tools within the conservation standards and how you use them in a project, those are available online and in person. I mean, kind of related to that, or related to coaching at least, Georgina's asking how the funding for a coach works. Does the organisation who needs the coach pay for their time, or is their time sponsored by the network? And this is a little bit, it depends. Sometimes there will be coaches based within an organisation, and in that case, it's kind of part of their job to support that team. In other cases, the organisation who's hiring that coach might hire them as a consultant, so essentially, paying for their time, or there might be that time might be donated by that coach potentially. So there's a whole range of different options, or that a partner or a donor might be sponsoring their time. CCNet itself, Caroline, correct me if I'm wrong, wouldn't pay for that coach's time, but CCNet is a voluntary network of individuals, so often coaches are supporting teams at a reduced rate, but it really just depends on the coach and the context. And the second part of your question there, would a coach assist on a particular project only? What about organizations running multiple projects with varying objectives? That's a great question. And again, it depends. So it depends on what that relationship with the coach looks like. Again, I mean, my background before I moved to my current position, I was a coach based within an organization, so I was supporting with the adoption of conservation standards across that whole organization. And in my current position now, I do similar sorts of things. So Caroline and her organization, Foundations of Success, we might go in, or Foundations of Success might go in and work on one particular project or a whole suite of projects and support that organization to look at adopting the conservation standards more broadly. So it really is dependent on the context and what that organization and team is looking for. I'm not sure, Caroline, if you want to add anything to that before I move on.
No, nothing to add. Thanks.
Yeah, cool. Okay.
I did, just following up on Georgina's question too about and others about coaches and coach training. I did put a note in here that coach trainings tend to be for people who've already had some experience and exposure to the conservation standards. So if this is of interest to you and you want to go deeper, I would at a minimum suggest going to the website I've put in the chat, where there are options for training. And even cooler if you can get involved in an actual process. But at that point, then I'd say you might be ready to take the next step and look into coach training.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. We generally, to qualify makes it sound very official, but to be ready for a coach training, you would need some definitely a solid grounding in the conservation standards, and preferably have gone through, as Caroline says, gone through that process with a project. I see a Matrix question there, wondering what you think is helpful starting points for having a discussion around introducing conservation standards into an existing project that doesn't currently have a framework like this. Caroline, do you want to respond to that? I can add.
Yeah, I was going to put in, well, so I think there are a lot of different approaches. One, just to even kind of generate the initial interest might be to look at our YouTube channel, and we have a series of testimonial videos where you can hear from different conservation teams around the world how they've used the conservation standards, how they've found it to be valuable. We're adding to those right now. We have kind of some short testimonial videos. We'll have some videos that focus more on each of the individual steps. So that's kind of a work in progress. One thing those are useful maybe to generate the initial interest, but to kind of hook people a little more might be to set up like a 2-hour session or something where they work on something like a theory of change. So teams often they have a strategy they're already using, and you can just start right there and say, well, let's start to lay out the assumptions and understand why are you using this strategy, and kind of start to build that out, use it to help them think about objectives and indicators. And it's just a way to give them a little bit of a flavor for it. So those are a couple options. I should also mention at ICCB in Kigali this year, we will be running a training, a one-day training. So and that's really kind of an introduction to this, but if any of you or your colleagues are going to be going to ICCB, I would recommend that you check that out if this is of interest to you. Catherine, do you have other suggestions?
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I mean, you can, I think drawing on, as Caroline was saying, drawing on case studies is often quite compelling. So as in theory, it feels like, oh, this is a lot of new work. Why would we do that? Our project's kind of functioning fine as it is. Kind of using a case study, maybe in a similar type of project, or from a trusted partner to close to what your team is working with. I found that to be really useful, because it really just brings it to life a little bit for people. And yeah, talking about what the different value is, and acknowledging as well that adopting or using the conservation standards doesn't mean that you need to use every single and do every single sub step in that step in that cycle that we've talked about, right? You could pull out and, as Caroline says, start off by maybe even just thinking about using a theory of change to lay out, or retrofit from a log frame into a theory of change, just to have a play around and see what the value might be. Yeah. Are there any other general questions, comments, reflections? Feel free to just unmute and speak up as well. I've popped the general contact email address for CMP in the chat. If you email that, you'll get Caroline.
The wizard behind the scenes.
Yeah,
That's great.
I'll put my email address in there as well. But do just drop us an email and ask us anything that you might want to know about. We're very happy to set up a time to have a bit of a chat, find out more about what we do and how you can use the conservation standards and